People who were friends with someone who later became a murderer, what were they like? He was completely normal from as far as we could tell, just a regular high school kid. Played soccer, was in the advanced classes, kind of quiet but a nice kid. Then one weekend he and another kid went and murdered a couple of professors with the intent of stealing their money and absconding to somewhere in South America, I believe. They got picked up at a truck stop a few states away a couple days later. Anyway, we didn't see him anymore and he's in prison for a few more years. Complete waste because he could have had a productive, good life. Don't kill people, kids. My boyfriend and his old roommate were friends with this guy who seriously gave me the creeps. He would always try to hit on me, even though it was my boyfriend's house, and was really awkward. One night after a party, my boyfriend and I were asleep when I heard his door open. It was the creepy guy. I shook my boyfriend awake and he asked what the guy was doing. He said, "Oh, I just wanted to say goodbye." After that I refused to go over if I knew he would be there. They eventually lost touch. Then a few years later we read in the news that he had shot and killed 2 police officers, then killed himself. I had a chem lab partner in college in the Midwest, 2013 or 2014, he was a very nice guy, very smart too. We were both into The Walking Dead, so we talked about that frequently. Then one day I saw the news, as well as a campus-wide email, and it turned out that he had just been arrested at the airport for trying to flee and join ISIS. So yeah, he may not have been a murderer, but I think eventual terrorist fits here. I knew a girl that let her boyfriend into her family's home and he killed her sister and brother that were around 10 years old, her brother who was 15, her father, and stabbed the hell out of her mother. She's in prison for life. She was quiet. I didn't know her as well as I did her other siblings. Her boyfriend didn't attack her older sisters. We had always thought that the sister who was a year older than her was going to be the psycho. Her sister had anger issues. We used to call her Rodman because she would get kicked out of games all the time because she would effing lose it. Anyway, she let her boyfriend into the house, he killed a bunch of her family. Why? Because her dad didn't let them date. She was a senior in high school. They only had to wait a couple more months and she could have just left. Such a waste. So much stupidity. When I was younger, a family friend dated a guy. I knew him from the time I was 5 and last time him when I was around 12. He was about 12 years older than I was. We will call him MM. Was from a rough neighborhood, but was always really nice to me and my family. Looking back, I think he may have been into drugs. My whole family liked him. He was always kind and personable to me, but in a non-creepy way. I saw him a few times a month for a few hours at a time and he always called me by my cutesy nickname and would talk to me like I was a peer instead of a little kid. He would joke around with my grandparents and an overall nice guy. About 10 years ago, he killed his aunt over a stolen vehicle, if I remember the details right. I was shocked. I knew he was in a rough area, but he was always such a nice guy. I also just looked up his info in the state's database. He had a few prior run-ins with the law, one when I knew him. So I was friends with Augustus. He was on the quiet side but was into MMA and UFC stuff, and I remember driving him to a few amateur fights when he lived at my home. I've known people that I didn't like and even feared but knew they were the kind of people you would want on your side if shit hit the fan. Augustus was that, but I never felt I had anything to fear from him. He was a gentle giant. Well, he moved away and I hadn't heard from him in several years when another mutual friend told me about the trouble he found himself in. You can read about it below. I do not know any of the other persons involved in the story whatsoever, but I strongly suspect that Augustus was likely manipulated into his involvement. He would not describe him as bright, and I absolutely could understand him acting in violence if someone convinced him that a person had assaulted a younger sibling of his. That part isn't elaborated on in the news story, but as I know several of his family members and mutual friends, it's what I've been able to piece together over the years since this occurred. So you assume that his co-defendant manipulated him? Wow. I did just look at both of their statements in court, and it looked like she was faking her tears, and he didn't seem bright. Slow people can easily become the victim of a sociopath. From what I've read, she also attempted another murder on her own. Not really answering this question directly, but I used to do maintenance and repair for some jails, juvies, and a prison. Not sure if this is the norm for jails/prisons countrywide, but inmates were generally housed together based on their crimes. Murderers were housed with other murderers, sexual assaulters with sexual assaulters, thieves with thieves, etc. I've seen and sometimes very briefly talked with the dudes who were housed on the murder wing. To me it was an eye-opening experience. They are not like what your depiction of a murderer/serial killer will look like or what TV shows depict them. They all look like and act like your average normal guy. I remember this one guy, every time I saw this dude he always looked all happy. He was busting jokes all the time, always chilling, never caused any trouble, very friendly, etc. He looked like a real bro and someone you could easily become friends with. But then you find out the reason for why he's in there in the first place. He strangled his girlfriend to death, proceeded to chop up her body and place them in trash bags, drove 300 miles to go dump the trash bags in wooded areas, all while being captured on camera driving his truck with the bags in the bed of his truck from toll booths. The cameras saw the trash bags in the bed of his truck and the trash bags missing on his return trip. Then he drove back home, proceeded to try his best to clean up the evidence and pretend like his girlfriend was away until he got caught and he was facing life in prison and a second possible murder charge that they were investigating him for. Just seeing him, you would never expect that out of him at first glance, which makes that all the more creepy that anyone you see or know has the potential for being a killer. I went to high school with a kid who brutally murdered his grandparents with a machete. True story, and he was literally the most funny, outgoing and life of the party type of guy I have ever met in my lifetime. At that point 19. He always told us about how he felt like his life was unfair because of his grandparents. Which really was weird because he seemed to be given whatever he asked for. His grandparents were somewhat wealthy. One night they caught him using drugs in his room, and when his grandparents tried to punish him, he chopped them up. A man convicted of murdering his wife was a friend of my wife when she and I were first dating. We meet with him a few times after our marriage. So I didn't know him great. I was going to include more specific details, but I see he is still in appeals. He was a refugee whose mom was friends with her mom, and they were of a similar age. Found out much later he had a huge crush on her. To be fair, he wasn't the only one. He gave her gifts occasionally before we were married, so possible early courtship. I didn't know him great, but he seemed nice enough. After my wife and I were married, we went to an ethnic restaurant where he was the cook. I remember that when we left 2 tips, one for him and one for the server, there was a disagreement because they had a policy of splitting tips which we didn't know about. So he wanted to keep the tip we gave him directly while also taking part of the table tip. It was odd that they argued about it while we were still in the restaurant. Although not in English, we could tell it was an argument about the tip, but only later found out the details. I thought that seemed rather sketchy and of poor character. Later we hear the news that he was arrested for murdering his wife and burning the house down while his kids were asleep. The kids escaped. He was convicted, but remains on death row. This is third-hand information. Turns out he wanted a divorce because his wife was involved in women's rights advocacy, and he found it embarrassing. Since she wasn't making it easy, he felt cultural pressure to get rid of her. The community of refugees that my mother-in-law was still in contact with were not surprised by the news, and felt it was life as usual from the culture they fled. I don't know that there was any real risk of my wife marrying him instead, but she kind of dodged a bullet. This guy always had parties at his house. Was charismatic. A year after I moved to another base, read an article about him murdering his wife. He was a really stand-up guy. Still is. He was a bit stabby. I don't get mad, I get stabby. Please like, comment, and subscribe.